Welcome back to the Game Plan Coaching Podcast, and this week's guest is Craig Morris. To use an analogy right from the start, if this episode was a weather forecast, it would be partly uncertain with a high chance of seeing things differently by the end. So who is Craig? Craig recently left Paddle UK after 20 years as an Olympic slalom coach. 4 Olympic medals across Tokyo and Paris, including Kimberley Woods double bronze and Adam Burgess silver at Paris in 2024. Now, Craig is working in coach development across a range of sports, and he's got a brilliant brain. He's a brilliant human. I've been lucky enough to work alongside Craig on a couple of projects, and he's without a doubt the gentleman of coaching. He's curious, he's warm, never the loudest in the room, but always the one saying something worth listening to. Craig's also an academic, even though he wouldn't necessarily say it himself. He's co-authored a paper called On the Wisdom of Not Knowing in Sport, Education and Society, written with Keith Davids and Carl Woods. It's all about coaches in high performance coming to rely too heavily on secondary information like data and reports and analysis at the expense of what's happening right in front of them. I've included the link in the show notes. So 2 things that really stood out to me in the conversation. The title of this episode, Prepared, Not Planned. I've used this phrase lots and lots after hearing Craig use it himself, and it came from one of Craig's athletes. Really useful for any coach to think about what prepared, not planned might mean to them. And the other point here, what do we need to let go of to see things as they truly are? This is Craig's question to the listener at the end, so reflect on that one. Right then, settle in. Hope you enjoyed the conversation between Craig Morris and myself. Here is the next episode of the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. I'm really interested in anything that perhaps along your journey has remained the same since you started coaching, has changed, or something that you might have stopped or started.
I would say fundamentally, I've changed. What's remained true and constant has probably been this deep-rooted curiosity within me, a desire to continue to grow, I suppose, and never to be stood still. And that itches me constantly, and I now find myself a victim to that at times in the coach development, learner design space, as I once was in the coaching space, and maybe even as I tickled trying to be a kayaker myself over the years. What's changed fundamentally is the way I see how people learn, or even, let's say, being awakened to how people learn, perhaps being inadvertently blindfolded to that through a majority of my coaching career. I then put that curiosity into that space deeply and became enlightened, I suppose, as to different ways that people learn, the individuality of it, the motor learning theories perhaps that underpin it, and everything in between. So fundamental change would be how I see the role of the coach in the learning process. However, that curiosity has been the one that has stayed the same. What stopped and started in between? Great question. I would say how well I've looked after myself in the field of coaching and coach development. That would have been something that's fluctuated, and I can probably mark that to some of those oh no moments or wow moments and how I've navigated around those over time. Wow moments would be significant shifts in possibility or behaviors that athletes perhaps didn't believe they would be able to achieve. By that, I mean individuals perhaps becoming fascinated in how they take up with their own learning and seeing it as a really good puzzle to explore from a position where previously they might have been all about winning, very much about how external individuals or organizations view their performance and what status means for them. An obvious wow moment for me would be the Paris Olympics. I can't deny that. As much as I am a process-driven coach, I would say the experience and success of those Olympics for our canoe, slalom and kayak cross team is a massively profound moment. Yet the biggest moment, as well as seeing the athletes fulfill something they'd worked so incredibly hard for, Tom, would have been my family being in the crowd. Wow. Firstly, there being a crowd, having had my first experience of Olympics in Tokyo with no crowd, and so many families dying to come out to see their loved ones perform on the biggest stage. to then having 12,500 people, including my kids, with banners, face paints, and everything in between. Probably another jolt moment would be those moments that we all have, I think, as coaches, unfortunately. Really vividly remembered two athletes asking me to go for a coffee. If athletes ever ask you to go for a coffee and they're buying, it's normally quite sinister. And them coming out with the lines like, yeah, I'm going to quit the sport. And me being completely naive and blinkered to that ever being on their radar on a couple of occasions. Yeah, something inside of me died on those days, I think, for a short time, until I understood them and the world they operate in and myself a lot better.
Wow. Some rich stories there, Craig, that you've covered very succinctly. There's so much I'd love to pick out. You said way back when you were talking about things that you've changed, awaken to how people learn and the role of the coach in the process. Would you tell us a bit more about what you mean by that and what exactly changed for you?
Well, I was brought up as a 5-year younger sibling to a brother who was obsessed with the aesthetics of canoe slalom performance. And one athlete in particular, Gareth Marriott, who medalled at the Barcelona Games, 92, giving away my age here, Tom. As a younger sibling, you obviously spend a lot of time following your brother around, and we were a one-car family, so I was dragged into canoeing largely, wanting to play football myself. So my early experiences were that this sport has a particular aesthetic to it. It needs to be made to look easy, swan-like, lovely and graceful above the water, working hard underneath. So when I took up with coaching at quite a young age, around 23, that was the premise with which I started. I was a very technically minded coach in order to bring everybody into this beautiful picture of this swan-like mechanics. Yet I thought I was pretty good at relationships. So I had a well-intended framework, if you like, philosophy of how performance was elicited as this magical equation of technique and relationships combining into this wonderful performance. What quickly became clear to me is that everybody's individual, and it's not the role of me as the coach, or certainly shouldn't be, to place them in my jigsaw, move the pieces around and combine them to make everybody look the same. That really doesn't do anyone a justice. It doesn't cater for individual motivations, need, physicality, circumstance, history, social connections. So it became clear to me in one of those moments were people quitting who I thought were having wonderful times. Those moments really helped me unpack what the sport was about and this notion of an end in mind. I started to consider truly what the demands of the performance were on race day. And that's always a question I think is useful to start with coaches, is like, what are the demands on the performer during the interaction of competition? And if you had to get some headlines out of that, what would they be? And for me, it was around dynamic decision-making, having an abundance of skill available to move between at any one time. And I realized my technical models weren't preparing people for that. And they certainly weren't catering for individuality, of biomechanics, of physicality, of action capabilities. So, several years of investigation, curiosity, connections, study, even tickling into academia myself. And I mean just tickling. I kind of had an about turn into more ecological approaches to coaching and learning and motor learning theories. And I guess situating the coach alongside the performer rather than where it was previously, which was a more hierarchical model, i.e. I have the knowledge and wisdom, I will impart that upon you with good intent and hopefully holding good relationships, and you will become a better performer for it. The slight slip of the tongue there was probably valuable in that a better person was probably what I moved towards. Like, how can we become better people together through this vessel of sport? And how can this vessel of sport speak to the individual and all their beautiful nuances and complexity? And so I guess the role of the coach became alongside, navigating or journeying through problems with performers rather than doing to them, becoming more open and embracing uncertainty, which we can no doubt mine a little bit later down the line.
Beautifully put answer, Craig. I've written a few notes when I've been listening to you. Coaching with, not to, stands out, and coaching alongside the athlete rather than, I guess, above them, and removing some of that hierarchy. For the paddlers that you were coaching, as you evolved as a coach and you became more collaborative and looked at things together. It was a journey you went on together rather than something you dictated. How do you think their experiences changed?
Yeah. I listened to the wonderful Alex Lascu with you prior to coming on today. What a wonderful pod that was. And I loved the giggleometer, or giggle meter, I think she might have called it directly. I loved that. And it made me think then, like, I think I love a noisy practice, or certainly do now. I probably once didn't. I think when I might have thought that was distracting of the purpose, not fueling the purpose, because I was looking at it through the lens of me as a coach and not trying to look at it through the lens of the performer. In that, I think sessions became more joyful for the athletes. They had a stronger presence, a stronger voice, a stronger sense of agency to go about the practice in many different ways rather than trying to fulfill a vision of the coach. So they were very much inside their own perception rather than having the perception of the coach as a constraint, if you will. And what I saw is it's wonderful if we get out the way a little bit as coaches. I personally have found that athletes shift how they take up with problems. They suddenly become, I hate to coin the phrase resilient, but there's a sense of more patience, more resilience, more purpose to solving problems. When challenges get tougher, they react in different ways if they're the ones driving the practice more themselves. If they're pursuing their own curiosities rather than the curiosities of others, perhaps with a lack of understanding of what the coach wants from them. So yeah, I believe strongly, and I hope I'm not speaking ill of them or for them, I think athletes have elongated careers due to a shift in my approach to coaching because they've found a newfound love for the sport. And some of those athletes are continuing long beyond my retirement to thrive.
Something I noted down when you were talking then was this shift from coach as a resource, not a constraint. You can utilize you in a different way to if you were just constraining the way they go about practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as a side note to that, I can think of one athlete in particular who always said to me, I want you to be a friend first and a coach second. And I know in a lot of organizations that would give a sense of trepidation, I think. A sense of fear around, let's not get attached, not too close. And quite rightly, boundaries, safeguarding, etc. It doesn't mean that for this particular individual. Yet, if we don't listen to what athletes want from connections in our environment, then how can we truly coach in the best way possible for them? So I think there's a real sense of how do we build connections stronger through our coaching, how we situate ourselves as a coach so that we give athletes the role of autonomy. You know, we'll all think about, and we'll touch on this shortly, we want athletes who can make decisions for themselves during the performance. I'm fortunate in that the constraints of canoeing mean that you can't really shout over a raging river. There's not often a big crowd. We see football coaches try to shout over big crowds all the time, and maybe that's, I think you can impact the game from the touchline perhaps, or most definitely within football or most team games. Different team games have different approaches. Rugby coaches will be in the stand, feeding into people or colleagues on the bench, football coaches front line. In my sport, you can't really have an impact once they cross the line. So that was clear from the off. So that sets the tone for how we coach in training. And often there's a disparity between that. And that's maybe something for us to look in the mirror and consider. How does a training coaching approach mirror what we want from the competition coaching approach?
So if we were to go along to the bank now and watch you in action with an athlete who you know very well, what might we hear and see and notice in the environment?
I was once told by a gymnastics coach, Tom, and I know you do frequent gymnastics on a regular basis. I was once told that I shouldn't be allowed to sit down in coaching. When they came to watch me, you'll often find me feet dangling probably too close to a cold river at times. I have fallen in the river from that coaching position a few times and lost many a pair of sunglasses, it's fair to say. Yeah, a variance. It depends on the session, doesn't it? Quite rightly. So, sometimes I will be seated. It's quite often deliberate, whilst it might look lazy to some. So often if you see me really low sat down on the riverbank, whilst perhaps needing a rest from running too much that week, it's more likely to be that I'm trying to get a different perspective, trying to get the athlete's perspective, Or I've maybe asked, where would it be useful for me to film from today in order to best help you learn more from this experience? You conversely might find me quite playful, quite energetic, quite vocal. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a silent coach, Tom, as you can tell from this test for 10 minutes so far. I'm anything but silent. So, yeah, I guess I'm adaptable. I like to think I'm adaptable to the needs of the situation, and I'm reading how others are taking up with their environment, how they've arrived. If it's a bit flat, I won't assume that I need to bring the energy, because that might be quite imposing and quite claustrophobic. We'll have those conversations. What do they need from me? What would be useful? What would be not useful from coaching this morning, given your intent and where you're at? So really adaptable, I think. And we would have clear lines of permissions of what my role was in any one session or any one period of work. Yeah, I think as I grew older and more experienced, I'm not going to say necessarily wiser as a coach. I would have been quieter than when I started.
Yeah.
I would have been giving more space for the struggle and let the practice breathe, as I often call it.
Yeah, nice language. I like that. And I think with the best intent sometimes, I've noticed, I've done it myself, I can get in the way by being too vocal, too frequent with communicating.
Mm.
Because you're not able to speak to the athletes all the time, or in competition they're gone, so therefore that changes your role in practice quite a lot. Is there a different emphasis on the conversation and the time you have with the athlete before being in the water, and how do you use that time to make sure that when you kind of cross the threshold into the practice per se, everybody's happy with what's about to happen?
Massively. I'm a big advocate of the sense that learning doesn't happen just within the session itself. It's over complex timelines, and it never starts and stops because we don't control it. What I would say is, though, that the importance of the informal and formal connection. So I would be quite tactical about when I appear in a car park pre-practice. You generally have a sense of when athletes arrive, which direction they arrive from. Yeah, just to maybe confirm the intent of the session. Is there anything different they want from me, given how they've woken up on that morning, sensing that? So, and I think what that does is it allows people to have their own space and time, physically and mentally, in the environment before they start, which is how it is before competition. So we won't often disrupt an athlete's pre-competition routine other than maybe a quick check-in, any late information that we've come from analysing competition, etc. So trying to mirror that in practice where, you're ahead of the curve in terms of being prepared for the session and having a sense of unity of your roles, and maybe some things to be mindful of, what might get in the way of this practice, that pre-mortem approach, if you will. Or if this practice is to go really well, what might we see, hear and feel? And therefore you've got a sense of just holding a mirror up during practice then. Do you remember this playbook that we talked about at the start? Well, this is where it's headed now. I'm curious what we want to do about that. And similar afterwards, or just letting it breathe afterwards. There's plenty of research out there that learning needs time to stabilize. We would have probably quite regular hot and cold debriefs. But essentially, bookending, but with open storylines, if you will, sequels, not closed books. The session, so that the session itself can breathe more easily because everyone's on the same page. And therefore, if I'm suddenly being quiet when an athlete is struggling, that athlete can have a moment and go, I know why he's being quiet. Not, he's disinterested. Why is he making me suffer? Why doesn't he just give me some help and an answer?
Yeah, from my own experiences, a lot of that comes about from that kind of framing or contracting with the players or with the athletes. With my coaching at Oxford, I only take the under 12s, different phase of development.
Remove only from that, please.
All right.
There is no sense of personal diminishing of quality and responsibility around that.
Only the 12s and just a coach.
Let's get all the cliches out.
Exactly. But when I've worked with them this season, I've made it really clear. There'll be times when I don't say anything in games when things are tough. And I'm not saying anything because I'm disinterested. I'm not saying anything because I'd love you to just try and solve the problem for a bit longer. And if you really need the help, we can get there eventually, but I want you to try and do it. And I think that helps qualify the behaviour, or at least have a shared understanding of why you're doing what you're doing.
100%. What you've looped me back to there at the start is that at a certain point in my career, it became really clear to me through the support of Richard Cheetham, actually, a good friend and colleague, that as coaches, I massively encourage you all to articulate why you coach the way you coach to the people in your responsibility or in your care, and leave that open to challenge, which is a really important follow-up statement. So don't assume coherence to that. Like, here's how I've come to understand me as the role of the coach, and here's why I coach the way I coach. As you've articulated beautifully there, Tom, here's some ways it may play out. You know, when you're 2-0 down with 10 minutes to go and you can't get hold of the football, you might find me silent on the touchline. And the reason for this is this. How does this sit with you? How does this compare to how you previously understood the role of the coach? Where is the challenge in that? When does the challenge become uncomfortable and we might need to harness it with some support? You know, really offer that out there, because I think only then do we truly build a partnership between us and the performers.
And I think that in that becomes the difference between the athlete understanding or just following. And like I'm talking about my coaching experiences, we should be talking about yours, but with the under-12s, they play in 3 different teams. They see me once a week. They go off to their junior Premier League team and they go off to their grassroots club. So they get 3 very different environments and contexts to practice. And I think, really important that they have a deliberately different experience when they come and train with me, because it's a learning opportunity. It's not about winning stuff. That could happen, but it's about the learning process and finding the joy of solving a problem rather than being told the answer.
I'm imagining an occasion, Tom, where all 3 coaches that they experience in a week came together and the players were able to describe each person's style, what they loved about them, where they think they could grow their coaching. That would be a really fruitful exercise, wouldn't it?
That would be awesome. Yeah, that would be awesome. Craig, in every episode of our podcast, I invite our guest to make an addition to our game plan. So this shared playbook of ideas and stories, memories, experiences. And I'm really interested to see what you're going to bring.
Fabulous. Thank you, Tom. Well, I'm going to pose a question to start. And it's a question to all you coaches out there, and one I regularly consider myself still in my coach development work. So the question is, how highly do you as a coach value adaptability in performers? How highly do you as a coach value adaptability in players, athletes, performers, whatever your context might be? And the reason I say that, Tom, is I'm yet to meet anyone who doesn't place high value on that as a skill within their performers. The follow-up question when you ask how often do you intentionally train it as a skill is often a very interesting self-reflection exercise. How often do you deliberately train adaptability as a skill within your working week, within your time with players? I'll tell you a little story here. I once did a presentation, and I was glad I'd discovered the value of adaptability at this point, a couple of years in, to Gloucester Uni, some MSc students over there. And at the end of my presentation around embracing uncertainty in coaching, I think it was, a rugby coach, female rugby coach, said to me, she put her hand up and she said, "Craig, do you intentionally train for adaptability? You've talked about how you value it massively. Like, do you intentionally train?" I was only 2 years into being able to say yes. So I've been in the place where I definitely didn't. I tried to control and, definitely constrain it fully so it wasn't a thing. I probably saw it as something to eradicate rather than embrace. And I was able to say at that point, yes, absolutely. Because for me, it's happening anyway, all around us. So why wouldn't we intentionally train it to catalyze the process, make people more aware of the value of it? As you've talked about there, Tom, you're silent for a reason on the touchline because you want to let players have the opportunity to breathe and solve problems and communicate through each other, because that's the essence of high performance in football. I would imagine, from the conversations I now have, been fortunate to work in the game changers, as people call it, are the people that solve problems directly on the pitch with synergy across their teammates and set problems for others through themselves and not through the coach. You know, we're just at the end of Six Nations, and we often hear about, the coach needs to get them in at half time because they're really on the back foot here, struggling, and they can't solve this problem. Yeah. How wonderful is it when you get the game changers that are able to have the autonomy and the agency, perhaps, from the coach themselves to navigate and journey through the game itself. Looping back round, my offer to the game plan is this notion that I came across through an athlete, Adam Burgess, when we were reviewing the Tokyo Olympics campaign, of prepared, not planned. It's become a phrase bound around lovely, and I've been fortunate enough to write with colleagues on this notion of something that became very real for me in my journey from a coach that was trying to elicit control, consistency, and to, I guess, own and overrule the athlete-environment interaction. So we paddle on very dynamic, wild rivers. Yet my early years of coaching were about trying to overrule those dynamics, I guess, for the athlete to be able to overpower them, control them, and stabilize. And I came to understand that wasn't possible, and I was looking at it the wrong way around. And this notion of about prepared, not planned, came from the journey with Adam, of him coming from a sense of, he used to have a slogan when I first worked with him, Tom, that was, I'll keep practicing till I can't get it wrong. And this would be on a very controlled, say, 3-gate sequence. He's gone on to win an Olympic medal, which is fabulous for him. And just to give it some context in the journey, he was already a very high-performing athlete at this point. So we found that over a couple of years working together, it became clear that I could set a course. We have very unique courses, there's never one course. So I could set a course or a route that would probably give him very little chance of performing well. And therefore we sensed we were really vulnerable to the sport itself because external coaches set the course and want different every week. So this notion of prepared, not planned came out of his mouth in review. I need to be more prepared, yet not planned, was his language. And I talk about this, I'll try and bring this to life. I talk about this on a continuum. And I've been at either end as a coach and probably dwelled in either end and found myself to be equally naive. And therefore there's this zone in the middle, which I think is a real playful sweet spot. And it's described in many different ways by different practitioners. But if we imagine a continuum, on one end is this notion of being meticulously planned, very rigid, very scripted. So maybe we've got all the elements, activities, drills, whatever you want to call them, of practice laid out. We've got times to them. We've got the numbers. We've got the rotation of players. We've got individual roles. We've got the constraints of 1-touch, 2-touch, etc., all laid out. And on the other end, we've got unplanned, which is we're just rocking up and playing football or going canoeing. And that's okay, by the way. That's okay once in a while or here, there. I often think when people say, I just want to go canoeing, there is still a purpose there, by the way. So there's a complete lacking of purpose or lacking of intentionality or directionality to the practice. So what became clear to me is if we live in the really scripted end, certainly in our sport, we weren't preparing people for the demands of the race itself, because the dynamics of water, wind, performers going before you, hitting poles and making them move, doesn't care much for your plan or your script. This isn't a theatre show. There's a lot of dynamic play in the environment itself. And people get frustrated. They're the people in my environment that you go, oh, how did you not see that coming? Or like, why have we got stuck on that blade there? There was clearly an option to go on another blade. And I guess I started looking in the mirror during those times and going, well, they're doing that because that's what we prepare them for. So I took it upon myself as a coach to take responsibility for some of the problems I was seeing with the performers, some of the performance questions. Now, if you go the other end to unbridled chaos, you're probably treating the sport with a little bit of disrespect, right? Because there are things we know. There are things that are largely stable and present in our environments, pitch size, number of players, the rules of the game, whatever it might be in your worlds, that are stable. And we'd be naive not to stretch towards that information. So that's the element of leaning into what the planning in the session. But at the same time, there's a side to our world that's perpetually in motion, that we're waiting on information to emerge. So in my world, that is the turbulence of a wave that appears and disappears. Therefore, it offers one thing 1 minute and something else the following second. It's having a rigid game model and positional play and assuming you can override the problem set to you by the opposition. Essentially, this zone of presence or zone of preparedness, if you're preparing for the game or training, It's like a zone of malleability in between. So we're leaning into information that we know. It's like two sides to the coin of attention. We're leaning into things that we know to be present in the world and therefore are more stable. Yet we're also having this beautiful, stable instability, if you like, by being response-able in terms of waiting on information to present itself. And that's where I think this notion of adaptable athletes really comes from. This ability, like the science will tell you, in order to be adaptable, you have to be on the cusp of instability at all times, which makes sense, right? If we're really inadaptable, we're very rigid, see something, do something, it's a flowchart of performance, which we do see out there in social media, flowcharts of decision-making and performance. I always find that quite bizarre when I think about actual coaching through the lens of a performer. And then, yes, this sense of being response-able, being on the cusp of instability all the time, and how we prepare athletes for that, and what that means for us as coaches. And perhaps we'll speak to that a little bit further down this conversation. Prepared, not planned, Tom. Hopefully articulated with some clarity.
Just to draw attention to some of the language that you used and the way you framed things. Response-able. I just noticed the ability to be able to respond to what's in front of you, I'm assuming, would almost be a definition around that. And this cusp
so
of instability.
I'll just accredit that if I can, Tom. Sorry to talk across you. So that comes from a paper from Carl Woods, who I've been fortunate to write with, a researcher down in Australia. And he's big. He's taught me a lot around this notion of verbs above nouns. So this sense of response-able as a skill. And an ability. If you think about responsibility, we don't often think of it as a skill. It's an ability to be responsive. We think of it as, yes, I talk to my kids about being responsible all the time, of course, often through bad parenting. Yeah, this notion of it as a verb, like we want people who are sensitive, responsive, adaptable. In invasion games, like the dark arts, they can have deception. They're all very skills that are on the cusp of instability. And at the essence of this mid-zone of preparedness or presence in this continuum of prepared, not planned, is really something called skilled intentionality, which is essentially keeping as many options open for as long as possible. So if we think about Messi able to dribble off both feet, really hard to get the ball off, my sense is that he has a high sense of skilled intentionality in that he has multiple possibilities for action open until the very last moment he plays his hand. It's, as Danny Newcombe would call it, it's poker, not chess. And he's always got a very rich hand available.
Got you. And that, skilled intentionality stands out. And that line there, keeping as many options open for as long as you possibly can. And this, I'm sure, then relates really closely to everything you've shared so far about practice and piecing this jigsaw together and being alongside the athlete. They're very connected. There's a lot of synergy between the approach you talk about and then the way that you want the athletes to enter the environment and to be. And I get the sense that prepared, not planned, because it came from Adam. That's something that you both embody, rather than it would feel like it would be limited in its approach if it was just the athlete who had this mindset or just the coach.
Absolutely. And it comes to that question we looped around earlier, I think, in terms of if you ask a performer what the demands of them are during the performance or the game itself, and maybe what separates those who are highly skilled and those who are maybe mid-pack, then I think their answers often are bound within this zone of presence. It's that sense of you've got to have some abilities to stretch towards what is known and be able to lean into those. However, it's the people who cover off mistakes. I'm doing the little inverted commas there for radio. And what I mean by that is I think the best performers in the world, if you're a less educated eye or a less experienced eye in that domain, you'll say they never make mistakes. Actually, what they're doing is just always adapting at a high level of sensitivity. And therefore, the mistake isn't evident to most, if anyone, because they're just being responsive. They're never really, truly living in a really stable platform where their hand is on the table to you and you're able to respond to their hand again. Oh, they didn't mean to do that.
If you were to draw this back to athletes who are earlier in their journey, learning the sport, how can you create, or how have you created, the right balance of structure and freedom? so that you're able to help them learn and grasp the fundamentals, but then start to become more attuned and aware of the environment around them, so they're then able to have that agency to make more better decisions?
I think it's about this sense of sampling, or dialing up or dialing down the level of information from practice. So if we consider the game day or the race run as the whole, beautifully embodied practice itself with all the information, depending on the level you're at. So for an under 12s, this might be parents on the touchline. It might be a non-league game because they're not in leagues yet, perhaps. If you're an Olympic athlete, you're talking about 12,500 people, one run to define your career, media, all this sense of funding and your personal well-being and financial stability on the line. So it can mean very different things, that whole. So consider what the whole is for you in terms of the event. And then how much of that information are we preparing them for in practice, and dial up and dial down the dosage. And I'm not a big believer in dualisms. I think I was chatting to David Farrock not long back, a former PhD student up in Sheffield Hallam, around flow and things like that. And I think we're too easy to have dichotomies these days. It's either or. I think of everything on continuums. Are we aware of the amount of information from the game itself that is present in practice? And if we're bringing too much structure, too much isolation, then are we truly preparing them for the game itself? Are they becoming sensitive and responsible to sources of information? I think, yes, there's the personal capabilities to consider. So we dial down, but we sample the information. So, we could get into practice design. That's a whole different podcast, I think, Tom. But that sense of how much does your practice represent the information from the game itself? And how is that appropriately scaled and dialed down or dialed up, to the individual within the team, because that's an important point. We shouldn't assume that amongst a squad of 15 footballers that a particular pitched level of practice will be appropriate for all. You're going to have people thriving, people struggling within that. You're going to need to dial up and dial down with different information, different rules, different opportunities for action within that group itself. So I think there's a sense of players and coaches sharing an understanding of what the game looks like, what the event looks like in its ultimate form at that appropriate age level. So, what are you building towards? And then how might that look in practice if it were dialed up, dialed down? And what might those different environments, so if you've got a really dialed down practice, just being clear what that's offering you at that current time. And conversely, what it might be not offering you. It might not offer as much transfer to the game. So it's not that we have to decide to not do it, but we're becoming more self-aware, more conscious of the choices we're making in coaching that. I'm going to do that around mannequins because of this. I'm aware, though, that the risk of taking away the information of an opponent trying to deceive me as I'm trying to deceive them, and they're setting me problems and vice versa, then I may not be preparing them to be sensitive to the right sources of information and perception in the game as well as I could be if I only do that.
Trade-off and dosage. And like you just said yourself, seeing the world through continuums, I feel like I've got to that recently where my experiences tell me, in football in particular, that I have seen things in the past through real extremes. It's either this or that. It's a technical practice or a block practice, or it's something more games-based. Well, no, there's lots of grayness in the middle that we can work around, and we can get the dosage right. So, and I think that informed choice from a coach, recognizing if I put mannequins in, then there'll be a trade-off for that. So I'm going to do it for an amount of time. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. I'm going to do it for an amount of time for a certain outcome and then move on to something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you've made me have a little epiphany there. I think often as coaches, we need to be aware that if we are having extremes in practice, what subliminal effect might that be having on our performers, on our players? So we've all got players who are like, they respond really badly when they make a mistake or when things aren't going their way. And I wonder if some of our extremes that we put into practice design are building this either or. It's like, I'm either good with this ball in this play, or I'm not good in this ball in this play. And therefore the effort goes up and down. I'm just trying to make sense of that as I wait. I'm pondering that, I guess, as I'm working through. I think some of the subliminal things we put into practice, either or, black and white, almost justification for my effort, input, output equations, be careful, are those present in our coaching language and our practice design, and what might be the unintended leakage of those into player behavior?
And we put so much on the players from what we bring with us, the baggage we have as a coach, our own ideas. And again, to add to that, I'm thinking now about mistakes and how I've always seen it, well, how do we help players feel like mistakes are okay and we can use mistakes as learning opportunities? But it's not as simple as mistake at one end of the continuum and success at the other.
Fascinating.
There's
We
a lot to work with
we
there.
banned the word mistake in canoeing, not successfully, I might add. There was an athlete rebellion around. That was still bleep, Craig, by the way. It was definitely a mistake. The intention behind me banning the word or trying to kind of have a bit of playful constraint around that language was, if we see it as a continuum, we're always just performing, right? As a verb, we're performing. Sometimes our actions lead to what we might class as less optimal performance or performing. And sometimes it's like really optimal performing. And we're not in control of how that beautiful, complex interaction always plays out, particularly not, let me use kayak cross as an invasion sport, for example, in our world. I can do some really high performing actions, yet still have a suboptimal outcome or performance. And therefore, if we see things on a continuum, I think we're more likely to be able to move between the continuum and respond in the next phase of play, rather than have this dichotomy where it's like, it's either good or it's not. It's either excellent performance or a mistake. And if we've got performers kicking a ball in the game, playing a pass that's intercepted and going, oh, that's a mistake, and they ponder on that for 1 second, and that's where their perception is bound to for 1 second, then that mistake could be manifested 10 times, right? Ball could be in the back of your net because you've missed your cover marker or the crossfield ball that was on. So yeah, I think just being really mindful of that. What dichotomies do we have that we might do well to let go of?
You've prompted me to think of verbs above nouns, especially with the word mistake. And if we reframe it as a mistake, and therefore the conversation with the player could be, well, it might not make the director's cut, but what did we learn from that? Could be a nice way of just reframing it for the people that you're working with.
I love that. That's made me, in a very different way, that's made me think about when I first started really shifting my relationship around adaptability. We celebrated adaptable moments through like a weekly montage. So I'd had a folder on my desktop and I was always looking for some weird and wacky way where they adapted to a situation that maybe previously I'd seen them drop body language around or drop effort on or look visibly frustrated by or compounded mistakes. Deliberate pause there. Thank you. Changing my language. So we'd start to celebrate that. And, you know, I saw you talked about how does it change athlete behavior over time. I saw people going, put that in the adaptability folder, Craig, please. So they were actually like looking for opportunities to be adaptable rather than previously seeing those as mistakes. You know, I'll be honest, and all coaches will be screaming at me going, yeah, but sometimes there's a mistake, isn't there? There's a scale here, right? But we're looking to move that scale as much as we can so people are responsible in almost all conditions.
Right, Craig, final part of our podcast conversation. And like you said to me before, you don't like the idea of giving coaches advice. So I'm going to change the question.
I don't feel qualified, Tom.
Okay, fine. I'm going to change the question for you because you're special. So in this section of the podcast, I usually ask the guests to share some advice that coaches might go and apply, edit, or reflect on and see what happens in their own environment. But I'll change it slightly for you, Craig. Are there any ideas that you'd like to put in front of coaches that they could work with that might then change the way they go about their practice?
What a beautiful example of great coach development moving alongside Tom. Thank you for that. I guess one thing I am happy to do is share a question, and it's a question that I've pondered greatly. I was chatting to Alex about it actually in the last day or two, Alex Lascu. What do we need to let go of as coaches in order to see things as they truly are? And I deliberately let that sit for a second or two there. And where this question comes from is really my shifting relationship with uncertainty or certainty over time. So I used to be a coach who would strive for certainty in athlete performance, and all of my coaching was trying to control the dynamics at play, control the instability, control the variability, and diminish it to the nth degree so we could get stable performance. And if we zoom out a little bit into a drone view now, we look at, I work in various sports, fortunate enough to do so. We think about the clamor for data insights, analysis, performance analysis. We now have coach developer analysts, and I'm not undermining any of those roles. With them comes a watch out for, I think, as with the advent of AI, which, I'm trying to embrace in the coach development space now as well. All well-intended tools, I guess, to grasp at consistent performance, understanding performance metrics, feeding those up through hierarchies in development academies, etc. And often looking to justify inputs, equaling outputs in our practice. I guess that's how I saw coaching 10, 15 years ago. What I've come to understand is that the complex can't be made complicated. And one of the greatest things I've ever done is reimagine my relationship with uncertainty. And I believe there's more power in embracing uncertainty and accepting it and trying to journey with it and through it, around it and over it, to use all football terms, than there is in trying to really control the controllables, as was a phrase I would have used very regularly in my early coaching. And that's just my personal take. So I invite that to other coaches to think about as a question: what might you need to let go of in order to see things as they truly are? And an example of this, I'll tell a story from a former colleague of mine, Polish guy called Andrzej Wojsz. He once said to me, and he was ahead of me in this reflection, he said, "Craig, sometimes when you speak about the sessions and the coaching, I wonder if you're seeing what you want to see." And he sat back through his wonderful beard and just nodded and smiled at me. And there is that sense. Perception is reality and all those things, whether you believe in those philosophical statements or otherwise. But we only have a certain capacity for attention in our perceptual processes. And therefore, if I imagine my old self with a really strict technical model of performance, when I view someone doing the performing, am I actually seeing the performance interacting with the environment itself? Or am I seeing how it evaluates to my vision of what it should look like? In other words, am I simply meeting my own knowledge? Or am I actually living my perceptual process as a verb? Seeing, doing, hearing, sensing, feeling. That's my offer.
Wow, fantastic. And my mind goes to thinking about the biases that we all bring to coaching. I recorded a podcast the other day. It was with your friend of mine, Keith Sharp. And Keith added to the game plan the 4 words: "It's never about you." And I can see the synergy there with what Keith shared and what you've shared. Actually, when you notice things, it's because there might be a collision with your own values, beliefs and biases, rather than the reality of what's really happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine Keith and we have sat many times after dinner on workshops together for too long into the night, chatting this sort of stuff. And it's that sense of what might I be getting in the way of? How am I myself getting in the way of something else? If we think that other than the athlete's first-hand primary perception of their doing, knowledge of their environment, if you will, everything else is secondary. My personal take is that everything else should be submissive to their primary experience. And therefore, we need to be careful what we're bringing in a secondary space, whether that be my views of performance, my technical models as a coach, or whether that be data insights, analysis. We need to be mindful. And this is why I hope we'll survive the AI revolution, Tom, as coach developers, because the primary perception of the athlete should lead the dance.
Yeah.
Everything else should be secondary. It has a role, but it should be submissive to the leader of the dance.
And like what you just said, you've reimagined your relationship with uncertainty. And I think AI is creating an opportunity to think about the relationship we have with that in coaching. Not it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's what's the relationship we want to have with it to help us do our jobs better. Craig, thank you. There's so much in this podcast, I think, for listeners to reflect on. I'll just pull out a couple of the questions that you've posed. What do we need to let go of as coaches to see things as they really are? You positioned earlier, why do you coach the way that you do? And to add to that, as well. How do you know if it's working for you? Might be a nice little follow-on.
Yeah, how do you generate feedback?
And know that learning's happening and taking place. And obviously your addition to the game plan, prepared, not planned, which I seem to live a lot of my coaching and coach development life by, if I'm totally honest. So final question, just to wrap us up for today. You've obviously a very reflective practitioner. You've been on a journey and learned so much along the way because you reflect and because you're so invested in what you do. But what's your intention at the moment? What are you working on as a coach or a coach developer?
Wonderful. I know you often talk about when were you last fearful, or when did you last put yourself in a situation feeling like a novice? So my leap into self-employed life was one, I would say. So I'm working on my ability to add value to others amongst disciplines that aren't ones of my own or ones I've inhabited for very long times. Fortunate to work a lot in football with people who've been in the game 30, 40, 50 years even sometimes. And yeah, it's a wonderful challenge for me to try and move alongside them, navigate with them, and hopefully build a relationship to add value to each other in that space. One particular thing I'm working on within that is holding tension, trying to hold a space for tension with others. I'll talk about that. So football has its very own unique culture. It's a very established game. It's a vast landscape, I guess, as you'll know better than I. And when we work in the coach development space, we're fortunate to be able to take them out of that world as well as support them in that world. And one thing I'm working on is really when we remove some of the constraints from people's environments, whether that be environmental, systemic, individual, hierarchical, whatever it might be, people have a freedom to play and explore maybe beyond what they would within those constraints. So we can give them joyful, wonderful, quite profound, eye-opening experiences that often elicit a response of, yes, but I won't be able to do that when I re-enter my world. So one thing I'm working on with them, with no answers or no preconceived solutions, is holding that space for longer, to go deeper, to be less dismissive on the face of it, and also then playing with how do we work with them within the constraints to disrupt that learning process a little bit and maybe get some pioneering activity in different areas.
We need more yes and conversations rather than yes but conversations. Yeah, definitely. And I think it's always a tricky one, actually, when you take coaches outside of their environment or take away some of their environmental constraints. And I've seen this analogy of the two goldfish in the water. One says, well, this water's a bit toxic, and the other says, well, what's water? And by taking a coach out and then bringing them back in, they start to notice more stuff about what's happening in their own environment. But love that. And the idea around holding tension, we're probably not doing our roles as coach developers as well as we could if we're just agreeable.
Absolutely. Craig,
thank you. Thank you for being a brilliant guest. It's been a delight to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please follow the show and share it with a coach who might find it useful. I'd love to hear your feedback and any ideas you have for future guests. You can get in touch through the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and go well in your next coaching session.